Please let the excuses begin. Shakur Stevenson versus Joe Cordina. The excuses have already begun. So it's time for Boxing Ego to release the Krakens. I made a previous video. Now you're getting the ego thoughts. Rumor has it, now as of me recording this video, this is not confirmed and official. On my channel, I strive for greatness and I strive for accurate information, aka perfection. And I know for a fact I do an amazing job, especially when you look at the landscape of boxing. Not a bunch of rushed videos and clickbait just to lure you in with fake news. Like, you know, I could put a super catchy title, but then you watch the video and it's just my opinion or there's no actual legs to it. I give you guys reliable information. Now, again, the fight hasn't been confirmed, but it's looking likely from many sources in the world of boxing. And this is no surprise to King Ego because I've already made videos, at least last week, where I told you that this was likely next, and I believe Shakur was going to team up with Eddie Hearn. He was in fact at the Terrence Crawford versus Madrimov fight. He was ringside, literally back to back with Eddie Hearn at the Jerron Boots Ennis fight, and then shortly after that at the Crawford Madrimov fight. So behind the scenes, it was very likely that he was trying to work something out as a free agent and see what his next move is. Now, I'm not mad. I mean, you're a free agent. You have to go with where the money's at or a good deal. The problem I have is, per usual, Shakur Stevenson has called out for names like Gervonta Davis. And then if, in fact, Joe Cordina is the name that's selected, that's a pathetic fight. You're talking about Joe Cordina, a domestic level guy who literally fought earlier this year and got stopped. He was stopped. Who asked for this fight? Who wants to see this fight? And to add insult to injury, there's different reports where it suggests that Shakur Stevenson was offered something from Tank Davis and may have turned it down because he wanted more money. This is not the correct way to build a star. I've been saying the same thing. Everybody wants to hate, not everybody, but a lot of people want to hate on PBC. But one thing PBC does know how to do is turn over a star in America. In America, the United States of America, the USA, the U.S. Not talking about, oh, Anthony Joshua, he can't walk around in Cardiff. He can't walk around in London without, you know, people noticing him. I'm not talking about the UK. I'm talking about right here in the States. Now, the problem is Shakur Stevenson became a free agent and people were chomping at the bit because he is a good fighter. He's a skilled fighter to see, hey, you didn't like how things ended with Top Rank. Where will he go? And again, to team up with Eddie Hearn, even on a one-fight basis, they're talking about this fight being on Artur Beterbiev versus Dmitry Bivol undercard in Saudi Arabia. What are we doing here, right? No disrespect to the kingdom, but that doesn't even seem like a card that matches. And it's hard to explain, but I truly believe that when you have the matchmakers and they're building a card, some fights and merging and meshing certain styles and a certain tempo of the card, that actually matters. Like, for example, when Andy Ruiz was fighting Chris Arreola, they had other Latino fighters on the same card. So it was to build kind of a La Raza, a Latino flavor for the card. Or you have a Canelo Alvarez. Canelo fought Jaime Munguia. So two fighters who hail from Mexico were fighting on Cinco de Mayo weekend earlier this year. They put Mario Barrios, who's Mexican-American out of Texas, and he goes by the nickname of El Azteca, that makes sense to me. And you're putting him in with another Latino from Argentina, Maidana's brother. You see how that works? So certain cards like that make sense. And I'm not saying you have to put Mexican fighters with Mexican and blacks versus blacks. I'm just saying there are certain cards that I can picture all these fights under one house. What I'm noticing from Eddie Hearn and Turkey particularly is like a smorgasbord of random fights, and they don't even really make sense. Like you look at Terrence Crawford versus Madrimov, legit in LA, that fight could have been on the undercard because more people probably came to see Pitbull, Rayo, maybe even Andy Ruiz, Miller, stuff like that. But it's just like this random medley of different fights. Like just think of it like food groups. I think there's certain foods that kind of pair well together, right? You want some pasta. You might get a nice chicken parm or chicken Alfredo, chicken and shrimp to go with that pasta if you have some fettuccine or whatnot, right? So certain things are peanut butter and jelly, hamburger and fries, cheeseburger and fries. These things typically go together. But like Dmitry Bivol versus Beterbiev, a fight at light heavyweight, and what that fight should be, and then potentially an undercard or co-feature of Shakur versus a guy coming off a knockout loss that's moving up in weight, sounds really bad to me. And it gets deeper. And I happen to be the only one with a pair of stones to call boxing and call it out as I see it, unfiltered, and give it to y'all real. There's a lot of people trying to make content, and it's struggle content, to mislead and push random agendas. This Shakur fight is buns. And what makes it even more buns is the fact that Shakur has been on wax hating on Gervonta Davis previously when Gervonta Davis and Frank Martin was announced. That's what makes it even worse, because how do you have anything to say about Tank fighting an undefeated fighter, southpaw, a good, really good ranked fighter? One of my favorite performances from Martin was the Michelle Rivera fight. Michelle Rivera was on a nice tear, running through the rankings. He was bigger than Martin. That was a great fight for him. You know what I mean? Even beating Artem Harutyunyan. Harutyunyan came to fight. Frank Martin prevailed, almost stopped him late. So it makes very little sense for Shakur Stevenson to be dissing Gervonta Davis, saying he don't take risks, he's a cherry picker, and Frank Martin, he's not elite. But you wanted to fight Frank Martin, right? And then you fought Frank Martin, his leftovers. That's what Top Rank gave you for your very last fight, Artem Harutyunyan. So this just looks really pathetic, and it looks like true hate when you could take a fight like earlier this year's Gervonta Davis versus Frank Martin and then try to find a way to denigrate the fight, and then you fight a guy who's not even of the weight class coming off a knockout loss. And I don't care to hear any excuses. I said this on my Twitter. There's going to be a lot of excuse makers, and it's pathetic. People are going to make excuses like, oh, it's his first fight with Eddie Hearn. I don't give a... Shakur is a top dude. He's a champion, and he says he's the best at the lightweight division. It's not like he's coming off a loss and he needs to, you know, get the groove back. Like, let's say Wilder, who just lost to Zhang or something. So I don't want to hear that. And now you guys, there's a lot of the usual suspects, the negative Nancy's, old media, and they're making these excuses for this particular fight. Like, oh, it's just a stay busy fight. But these same individuals hate on Tank, Gervonta Davis, 24/7. They get mad when Tank is fighting Pitbull Cruz, right? They get mad when Tank's fighting Rolly. They get mad when Tank's fighting Frank Martin, who's undefeated. If you look at Tank's last fights, he fought several fighters that were undefeated or had one loss maybe in his last several fights. Hector Luis Garcia, Ryan Garcia. They hate on all these fights. Now all of a sudden, because it's non-PBC, they are optimistic. You see how that works? Now all of a sudden they have optimism and they can see the value in a stay busy fight. But they can't see the value in Tank versus Rolly, which was highly entertaining in the buildup and the press week. Tank pushes him off the stage. It was just he made it a big event, the two of them, right? And then the fight ended in an explosive knockout. So all of a sudden, they're pessimists when it comes to Gervonta Davis, and they can't see why on earth a Frank Martin and Gervonta Davis fight will be made. And they go as far to hate and say that Gervonta Davis needs to step it up as a champion and he ain't fought nobody. All of this hate, but then Shakur's a champion. His last two performances haven't been explosive knockouts like what Gervonta Davis gives you 90+% of the time. And now they're trying to cop please and explain why they feel a fight with Shakur and Cordina. Oh, Cordina's not that bad. Oh, Cordina, it's a stay busy fight. Oh, it's his first fight with Turkey and Eddie Hearn. Oh, da-da-da. You're justifying an American name who we've known about since he was a teen, fighting in Saudi Arabia, where it'll come on, especially if you're on the undercard, at a non-eventful prime time for America. And then these same dudes talking about Turkey saved boxing and Eddie Hearn is the best promoter in the sport, right? What does this do for Shakur Stevenson? And with my opinion, I feel it's the opposite. Fighting a guy like Joe Cordina is a lose-lose situation. Why not Edwin De Los Santos? Do a rematch with him. You had to at least get respect if you clean that up. So you pick bottom of the barrel. You pick the bottom of the barrel, a guy who hasn't proven himself in the weight class as a champion, and a guy who's coming directly off a knockout loss where he was getting bludgeoned and battered. And then you're trying to, it's disingenuous, people. You're trying to sell that fight and talk up Cordina, but you were down talking Frank Martin. Then you have idiots saying like, oh, Cordina would beat Frank Martin. We don't know that. Cordina, what has he done at 135? People, oh, he's a two-time champion. I don't care about none of that. What has he done at 135 for you to say that he would beat Frank Martin, who's now moving up to 140 and was a big lightweight, a buff, brolic lightweight with explosive power, and it's a domestic level dude. This is a horrible fight, and the people involved should be ashamed of even considering a fight like this. And the reason why I got to come down on it so hard, no Diddy, is it's hurtful to the progress of Shakur Stevenson. He is a good fighter. He does have skill. People have been complaining about his last two fights, and now they're definitely going to complain. Artem Harutyunyan off a loss is arguably better than Joe Cordina in the lighter division off a loss. At least we knew who Artem was from the Frank Martin fight. And I'm not even condoning the Artem fight, but we know that Artem at least was a lightweight and an Olympian despite coming off a loss. But for the second time in a row, Shakur Stevenson will be fighting a guy off of a loss, and Shakur can find it in his heart to try to talk up a domestic level UK fighter coming off a loss and make that sound good. But then he gets on podcast hating on Gervonta Davis and hating on Frank Martin, talking about Frank Martin's not elite. He hasn't said that Tank is not elite, but he said that Tank is not a risky dude, and why is he not fighting Edwin De Los Santos? It looks absolutely insane, period. And to the point where if you're justifying the fight and you was the same one hating on Gervonta Davis making up fight, people were like, remember when Jose Valenzuela brutally knocked out Chris Colbert? These are the same dudes in boxing who there was speculation that coming off the Chris Colbert knockout in the rematch that Tank might fight Rayo. And they were making complaints about a fantasy fight which was never announced, and he didn't even end up fighting. He ended up fighting Frank Martin, but they were saying like, oh, Tank wants to fight flat-footed Mexicans. He wanted to fight flat-footed Latino fighters and Hispanics. And he didn't even pick us. And they said he was ducking black fighters, and he never wants to fight southpaws and black fighters. And then he fought a black southpaw and Frank Martin, and then Rayo ended up beating Pitbull and had his own path. But you had these guys, the usual suspect, these content creators who are saying the opposite of what Boxing Ego is saying, and they had no justification. and they were hating on Ryo getting an opportunity. Bear in mind, Ryo is a known person, a known power threat, and he showed you he can box, and he's Tank's mandatory, which some of y'all didn't know. So if you can find it in your heart to try to talk up a silly fight with a guy in a lighter weight class coming off a knockout, then I don't want to ever hear anything about who Gervonta Davis can or shouldn't fight, guys like El Rayo, but then you somehow can make it sound good and try to nice it up for Shakur Stevenson, who's not giving you these electric knockouts, by the way, you know, and his last two fights were complained about, the Edwin De Los Santos and Artem fight. And then you're going to really try to act like you want to see him fight Cordina. It's pathetic, it's disingenuous. And I swear to you, if I wasn't making this type of money that I'm making in boxing, I wouldn't deal with a lot of people in boxing at all. It's not my cup of tea. I love the sport of boxing. I'll forever love the sport of boxing. But a lot of these dudes in media and content creators are corny. And I don't like corny energy around me.